Right, it's past, so I think we'll make a start. This afternoon, everybody. Oh, hi, Sue.
Hi, Sue.
So this
Hi,
afternoon,
Rachel.
hi, Sue, a webinar. Rachel's going to be talking about ICON and GP practice. So if you can all put yourselves onto mute, that would be really helpful. Then don't get any back noise. I'll let Rachel do her own introduction in a minute. All the presentations are being recorded and put on the website afterwards. So if any of your colleagues haven't seen them, they can. We're encouraging, it's for you to get as much out of the webinars as possible. So do ask questions, put things in the chat box, comments or anything. Do do add them into the chat box, or just put your hand up if you need to ask a question. We'll also put a valuation at the end for you to just complete a couple of questions for each webinar. And I'm going to be sharing Rachel's slides, so I won't be able to see any of you in a moment when I start sharing. So if you could, if there's any questions in the chat box, we'll probably have to pick them up at the end, because I'm not sure Sue can see her chat box. Otherwise, I will just hand you over. I'm going to turn my camera off and my mic off, and I'll hand you over to Rachel, and I'll put my screen on to share.
Thanks, Sue. So I'm Rachel Jolly. I'm one of the, I'm a GP up in Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent. I'm also the GP ambassador for ICON. So they've asked me to talk a little bit today about how we use ICON in general practice. Just a few housekeeping rules. If you can, try and make sure that your mics are on mute. If you have got any questions, if you can use the either hands up or the chat, and then obviously I'll try and keep an eye on the chat as we go along. Are you all right to share the slides for me, Sue?
Yep, I'll share those now.
Thank you. So we have adapted this set of slides from one that Suzanne Smith uses for ICON, and there will be bits that I probably skip through a bit more so that we can focus a little bit more about how we use ICON in general practice. So, next slide, please. So I'm sure a lot of you know this already. So what is abusive head trauma? So it was previously referred to as shaken baby syndrome, and it is a form of child abuse. It can cause catastrophic injuries, brain injuries, bleeding behind the eyes, bony injuries, and the causal mechanisms are rarely confirmed. We believe that it's due to acceleration and deceleration, where the babies are shaken up and down, and obviously impact. Now, 1 in 14 of these cases is fatal before the child is discharged from hospital, and half of those who are severely injured actually dies before they're at the age of 21 years old.
Have I stopped sharing now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was trying to let people, it's hard trying to let people in, and sorry, it's
no,
just...
you're fine, don't worry. Because I can probably try and admit people as I'm going along, so it comes up on mine as well. There we go. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide now. Thank you. So in Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire, we have a really high rate of perinatal mortality, and it's one of the highest in the UK. And some of that is obviously due to abusive head trauma. So we've been really pushing ICON since it came out in the hopes that this would obviously help to reduce the perinatal mortality locally. So in a district general hospital, a paediatrician might expect to see a case every 1 or 2 years. And studies were conducted over in the USA. 2.6% of parents actually admitted to shaking a child under the age of 2, and 9% had said that they'd felt like they wanted to shake their child, which is obviously quite concerning. The cases seen by paediatricians, and obviously that only accounts for a proportion of all cases of abusive head trauma. Abusive head trauma is the leading cause of death and long-term disability in babies who are abused. Next slide, please. And there's lots of cost implications associated with this. So just bear with me, I'm just letting people in as well. So obviously there's a significant cost implication because of the survival with a significant brain injury and or death. There's the emotional cost, there's long-term hospitalizations. I think there was, I trained as a paediatric nurse before I qualified as a doctor and went on to do my GP training. I worked on intensive care. And we had a child who'd been brought in, well, a baby who was brought in, and they had an over 18-month stay on intensive care and required long-term ventilation for the rest of their life. So obviously that has massive costs associated with it. And in addition to that, you've got the long-term medical services. So you've got all the physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language, educational needs. Has the baby or young person got to be placed elsewhere, so foster care, and obviously all the family and criminal proceedings as well, prison, and so on. So there's massive, massive costs associated with it. Next slide, please, Sue. So who shakes and why? So 70% of the perpetrators are male. So it's the fathers or male carers in the house, and that was found in a study done back in 2008 and 2010. And that can be a really difficult group to reach. If you think about all of the people that attend the antenatal checks, postnatal checks, the 6 to 8 week checks, it tends to be the mums that come. So it's really difficult for us to get in touch with those dads and educate them about ICON and about the normal crying curve. It can occur in every socioeconomic group. And caregivers, it's quite easy when they're sleep deprived to lose control and shake the baby, because when you shake the baby, it stops crying. And as we've just mentioned, there is this normal crying curve, and it shows that there is a relationship between the peak of the crying curve and when babies are subject to the abusive head trauma. And I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So you tend to see that there is an increase in cases within the first month of life. It tends to peak around the age of 6 to 8 weeks, and then it starts to decrease during the 3rd and 5th months of life. Next slide, please, Sue. So this is that normal crying curve that I mentioned before. So at 2 weeks, obviously the baby cries a little bit, and they're getting used to everything. And then at 6 to 8 weeks, that's when the peak of the crying tends to occur. So obviously every baby's different. We're not saying that every baby's going to cry loads and that, you know, they're really going to struggle at 6 to 8 weeks, but we do tend to find that it peaks at that point, and then thereafter it starts to reduce a little bit. So next slide, please, Sue. And this just shows the relationship between that normal crying curve and the number of cases of abusive head trauma. So you can see that the peaks tend to occur around the age of 6 to 8 weeks. So coping strategies. Well, it's very difficult sometimes to control babies crying. We can make sure that they're fed, we can make sure that their bottoms are changed, that they're warm, that they're not too cold, give them a cuddle, and sometimes they continue to cry. And obviously if we're unable to control that, then that can lead to frustration and distress for the parent or carer. So it's very much a case of trying to support that individual, those parents and carers, through the problem rather than trying to find a resolution to it. So it does need a very careful approach in how to do that. Next slide, please. So there's a few different studies, and I'm not going to go through these in depth. About does prevention work? And it showed that education does seem to reduce the incidence of abusive head trauma in young children and babies. Now, I think because of the sample size of the studies, it is questionable how reliable this information is, but it does seem to indicate that education does make a difference. I think we can probably skip through the next 2 or 3 slides. So that's it. So there's various touch points, and this is what we try and push with all of the parents and carers that we come across, and this is what ICON stands for. So I is infant crying is normal. So talking to them about that crying curve, letting them know what is normal. It can get worse at 6 to 8 weeks before it starts to get better, but it's normal. C stands for comfort methods, and that's things that we should try and soothe the baby in the hopes that that will help the crying to stop. So making sure that the baby is fed, making sure that they've got a clean bottom, making sure that they're warm and comfortable. Do they just need a cuddle? If that doesn't work and the baby is still crying, O stands for it's okay to walk away from your baby. So making sure, obviously, that we've tried all the comfort methods, putting your baby in a safe place, so popping it back in the Moses basket and just going away and having 5 minutes to have a breather if you feel like it's getting too much. And the N is never, ever shake or hurt your baby. I remember going out, I think it was after I'd had my second baby, and my husband left my husband in charge, and throughout the evening I was getting text messages saying, are you coming back soon, are you coming back soon? And I got home and I said, oh, where's the baby? And he put her in the downstairs toilet in the Moses basket, but he says, well, it's dark in there, and she kept crying, and I'd fed her and I'd changed her bum and she just wouldn't stop crying. So I thought, well, if I just put her in there for a few minutes, she'll be okay. She was safe. She was in a Moses basket, but he'd done the right thing. He'd put her somewhere safe and then just gone to have a few minutes to himself just to calm down before going and getting her back and giving her a cuddle again. Next slide, please, Sue. And this just reiterates what we've just said. This tends to be what you would see in practice. We have this stuck up at changing stations in the GP practice. Midwives and health visitors give this leaflet out to all new mums and parents. And it's something that we obviously try and reinforce at regular intervals. Next slide, please. So if you can, this is it's really small, so I'm not sure any of you can see it, but it's just how and when ICON can be discussed. So there's various points when we try and bring it, and I think there's lots of studies that have shown that obviously reinforcement and regular sort of information at various contact points will eventually help that information be absorbed by that individual. So high school, we can start to educate high school children about ICON so that they're aware of it even before they have children, or obviously some people might have children at that point. At birth, so the midwife should be educating new parents about ICON at that point. At any of the checks done when the child is less than 10 days old, when the health visitors go for their initial visit, when the 6 to 8 week check is done. And this is where the GPs can come in. So I know that depending on what system you use, so on EMIS we have the 6 to 8 week template. As it stands at the moment, ICON isn't mentioned on the template. We have things like, do you feel safe at home, and so on for mums, but it would be quite useful if we could bring in about understanding about the normal crying curve. How are you coping with the crying? And that's a question that I just slip in when I'm asking the other ones, is how are you coping with the crying at home? Are you aware of ICON? And some of them will say yes, and some of them will say, oh no, I'm not sure, I've heard of that before. And that's an opportunity to go through what ICON is, what it means, and how to manage with babies when they're crying, and where to get support if they feel they need it. The other thing that I will try and bring into practice when I'm talking about ICON, because obviously most of the time, as I mentioned, it's mums that we tend to see at those appointments, is dad aware of ICON and what that means? And just say that, you know, I'd really encourage you to let dad or grandparents know about ICON as well, so that that message can get relayed and hopefully sort of further decrease the risk of abusive head trauma. Next slide, please. So measuring impact. So ICON can have an impact on the number of parents or carers attending the emergency departments. And I certainly saw this when I worked in A&E as a GP registrar. Often in the middle of a night shift, you'd have parents that would turn up going, I just can't stop them crying. And you'd examine the child, they were absolutely fine. And it was just a case of reassuring the parents that baby was absolutely fine. And it's just a case of trying to soothe the baby where possible. So hopefully by educating parents about the normal crying curve, that would sort of reduce the number of unnecessary attendances to emergency services, as well as obviously reducing the possibility of abusive head trauma. And then the qualitative measures. So just asking parents, do you remember being told about ICON? Can you recall it? Have you got the resources and the materials that you need? Do you know where to get support? And so on. And then, as we've mentioned, the studies that have been conducted have shown that there seems to be a reduction of abusive head trauma in babies and young children. However, it's not sort of a completely reliable source for measuring impact. Next slide, please. So Hampshire did conduct a study, so they did an audit back in 2018 that showed only 10% of GPs routinely asked about coping with crying when they did their newborn baby checks, or when they obviously saw parents with young babies in practice. They then did the audit again back in 2019, and at that point 95% of GPs routinely asked about coping with crying at 6-week checks, and 93% of them stated that ICON helped them to do that. So that's a massive, obviously, improvement. So we locally do regular sort of what we call lunch and learn sessions. It's just an hour, and we tend to do them at a lunchtime. And we try and run them sort of once a month or so, where we talk about various different safeguarding topics, and ICON will be one of those. So we will run it on. The GPs can log on via Microsoft Teams, via a link, and then obviously they get an hour's worth of safeguarding training covering various topics, but obviously it gives us the opportunity to educate and reinforce the message about ICON as well. So that might be something that can be rolled out in your areas as well. Next slide, please. So implementing ICON. So research has indicated that abusive head trauma prevention programmes are most effective when that same message is given by different professionals on a number of occasions, and that's what I've mentioned previously, is that constant reiteration helps to sort of hammer that message home. So for babies born prematurely or requiring neonatal intensive care, it's recommended that the premature baby ICON leaflet is given. And obviously that the ICON message is discussed with them as part of the discharge planning for their baby. And I know certainly when I've had my children, they weren't premature, but the midwife certainly went through all the different leaflets that they give out, and they did talk to me about ICON. And that message was reiterated when I saw the health visitor and so on a few days later. So ICON message can be reinforced, and parents can be supported by health visitors, specialist community neonatal nurses, practice nurses, the GPs. The other thing that I was thinking might be really good in trying to meet, trying to reach those hard to reach dads, would be if the GP practice sent a message out to the new dads. And just say congratulations on being a new dad, and then maybe just put a few links in the text message, including ICON, so that they can be aware of it and they're incorporated into that. Because I think dads can feel quite left out when a new baby arrives, because it's all the information is given to mum. She's off with the baby, and obviously she's getting all the support as well. So it might be quite a nice touch and a way to reach those dads as well. Next slide, please. And that's it really. So there's some resources on the ICON website that you can obviously access and have a look. But I think all we try and encourage is the basic message really is just try and ask just those few simple questions in your GP practice. So particularly at the 6 to 8 week check, it's really, really easy to just say, how are you coping with the crying? Are you aware of ICON? Is dad aware of ICON? And then perhaps thinking about other things and how to educate parents and carers as well. So perhaps you could send your text message to the dads if GPs in your area aren't too familiar with ICON, then it would be a possibility of asking perhaps your named child safeguarding GP or whatever to do a session on ICON and to educate those GPs as well. Has anybody got any questions at all?
Thanks, Rachel. That was great. Thank you very much. Anybody got any questions or comments? I know sometimes some areas have found it difficult to engage GPs, not engage GPs, to get the message out to the GPs. So like you mentioned about the lunch and learn, that's because you're all obviously so busy, that's a good way of doing the training and sharing the information with the GPs, isn't it? That's a really good way. And like you say, sending a text message and including the dad again, that's a really good way for dads to get the message. Do your nurse practitioners or nurses, when they see the babies, do they all deliver the ICON message as well, or not? Rachel,
Say again, sorry.
do your nurses, if they come for vaccinations, when the babies come for vaccinations, do they talk about ICON as well?
Yeah, so they might not do it at every appointment, but they're certainly aware of it. And I think they're definitely in the GP practices that I've worked at, they do. So it is
Somebody's put,
something
I
that
like that, Ardon's link, it's the ICON leaflet. So is Ardon, is that the SNOMED thing? The same as the SNOMED? What's Ardon again?
It's the templates.
The template, yeah.
Yeah.
So you can link that, forgive my, I know obviously SNOMED code has been, one of the other GP ambassadors spent forever trying to get the SNOMED code, didn't she, Rachel Bryony?
She
So
got
she's,
it.
yeah, yeah, so we've now eventually got a SNOMED code for System 1 and for EMIS, so that's really fantastic.
Yeah, so even though it isn't on the template, if you just type in free text that you've discussed ICON, it brings up the SNOMED code and then you can obviously just click return and that inputs it in to show that you've discussed it then.
Yeah. Has anybody else got any other comments? But I think, you know, it's just having those conversations, isn't it? So when they come for the 6 to 8 week check, and unfortunately, at every touch point, really, it's people find it difficult because dads aren't always there. So it's looking at different ways to do that, but having those conversations each time you see them opportunistically, as well as the 6 to 8 week check.
Yeah, definitely.
And something that's been mentioned throughout the week is looking at developing a resource for grandparents and other carers, which, you know, it might be quite helpful for people as well. So that's one of our actions that we're going to be looking at after ICON week.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Has anybody else? If I'll put the link in the text for the evaluation, it will be on the website, so you can listen to it again, share it with your colleagues. And but if you have any questions or you think about anything afterwards, you can email me and I can direct to Rachel, or I can answer the questions if I can, or if not, I'll send them to Rachel. Right, I'll just put that link in. Thank you very much for all your hard work that you do with ICON.
No problem. Well, thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.